Hello, everyone. Great to see everyone. My name is Brian Buchanan. I am the president of the Spokane Society of the AIA. My pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker to you. And before I do that, just a couple little housekeeping things, some other things that I'm going to talk about for you here. First of all, it's your first time joining us. And actually, I did chat with some people their first time joining us. So if you keep coming, you will get sick of me saying this every month, but probably a lot of people are. But who is the AIA? What are we? Well, our AIA is the North America's largest and oldest archaeological organization. Its mission is to excavate, educate, and advocate on all things archaeological and cultural heritage around the world. So thanks to the support of our members across the country, but also support of our members here in Spokane, we are able to support excavations and investigations around the world. We can support publications on the important archaeological research that's occurring, and we help to preserve archaeological sites around the world. You can read about it in Archaeology Magazine. It is one of the largest magazines focused on archaeology in the world and is one of AIA's kind of premier publications. If you become a member of the AIA, we really do appreciate that here. Because one, you're helping support the AIA, but the more members we have, the more money National kind of gives back to us. So yay, we can bring more speakers and do more fun events. As a member, you do get a subscription to Archaeology Magazine that comes, I believe, every 2 months. And we also have a bunch of the back issues, I think, sitting out on the front table there when you came in. I want to point out the National AIA website. Archaeological.org. They got in early with their names. Good for them. You can see a lot of things going on in the world of archaeology. AIA has an online speaker just about every month from scholars from around the world, and they're free to go join and see. But also, the AIA sponsors a bunch of different local archaeology events all around the country, archaeology fairs. Potentially, you might be really intrigued. They do archaeological site tours around the world. So all of that is over at archaeology.org. Here in Spokane, you can keep abreast of our upcoming events in a number of ways. One of which is thanks to our own Dr. Rachel Horowitz. We have an e-newsletter that goes out, I believe, quarterly. And if you're interested in receiving that, we just need your email and we will send that to you. That tells you a little bit about what's happening, future speakers, some other events that the Society is putting on. We also have our own webpage, Spokane AIA, that mostly I keep abreast of updating. It generally has the speaker information. It has links to other kinds of archaeology happening around the world. And we still do have our Facebook page for those of you who still use Facebook, which also kind of does the same information. I do want to point out from our webpage, or you can do it on your own, you can get to our YouTube page where many of our past speakers have allowed us to record their talks. We put those up. There's some great ones in the past to take a look at. Dr. Brian Buchanan, he gave a great one a few years ago. Really recommend his stuff. But no, we have some amazing speakers that have done some recordings that you can take a look at. So before I go on to too much information, I'd like to read the museum's land acknowledgement. We'd like to honor the original people of the lands on which we stand by recognizing this as the traditional homeland territory of the Spokane tribe. Their presence here since time immemorial can be seen and felt within these museum walls and in the surrounding landscapes. With gratitude, we'd like to extend a thank you to the Spokanes, past, present, and future, for sharing this space as a place for artistic and cultural expressions to be enjoyed by all. So before I get to introducing tonight's speaker, I do want to go over what's happening in the future. Next month, we have Dr. Nora Donahue from Gonzaga University coming to talk to us about their research on Etruscan workshops. And we have, in January, a graduate student from Washington State University. And this is kind of a new thing that we're going to try to do. We're going to try and highlight some local postgraduate, graduate student research in the region. Generally, we'll do that in January month, but it might change depending on that, who can come and when. So this is the first year we're going to give that a try. We're trying to highlight some of the local research being generated in our region. And that's going to be Jordan Thompson, who's a Washington State University graduate student. Hot off the presses in that I made the slide this morning. This is something that we've been talking about on the board to build more community. One of which has been like the wine receptions that have happened the last 2 months, which probably is a great way to build community. But the other is that we're going to start a Spokane AIA book club. Now that book club is going to be focused on archaeology, and we may not even be reading books. We may actually be like, let's just get together and talk about the latest issue of Archaeology Magazine, some of the articles that are happening there. Our first meeting is going to be next Sunday. If you are interested, email me, brianbuchanan1@ew.edu. You can find me on the Eastern Washington University webpage because I am an associate professor there. And just let me know if you're interested, and then I will get the venue. If like 3 people tell me, then we might just be at a coffee shop somewhere. Hopefully 50 people don't tell me because I don't know if we have those venue spaces in Spokane, but I would love to see as many of you outside of these lecture halls and get to meet you and know you a bit better. So our first meeting will probably just be discussing about what we're going to read together in the future and also socialize with one another. Oh, great question. It's probably going to be in the afternoon. TBD venue, TBD time. So if you're the first person to write me and say, I can only be there at 2 o'clock, guess what? You just picked the time for me. Let's not do too early in the morning though. I can't do that. How often? Once a week? Who said that? That's not one of my students. That's not one of my students saying that, is it? Once a week. I think we will probably go for once a month. And if people are really keen, maybe we'll do twice a month. I'm not sure. Yeah. This was actually, I met with some of the people at the National Committee talking about ways we can rebuild some of that community I felt was lost during the COVID pandemic. And this was a suggestion made. And I thought it was a pretty good suggestion, actually. And by the way, the logo will change. That was a really quick AI logo. That's supposed to be the Spokane River in the middle of that book, but I think AI kind of missed something this morning. But it was enough to throw on the slide. So tonight's lecture is actually part of the National Lecture Program. So thanks to the AIA and thanks to all of your support, the National Lecture, the Society sends out a national speaker once a year to us that gives an amazing talk on their own scholarship and on their research. So that is what we are going to be listening to and enjoying this evening. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, just a reminder, this is a live presentation. And it is being recorded by the AIA, but recording by attendees is strictly prohibited because the AIA respects the intellectual property of its presenters, and we ask that the viewers, both here and online, to do the same. Thank you very much. So it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker for this evening, Dr. Sabina Cveček. I forgot already. I'm so sorry, Cvecek, who is a sociocultural anthropologist and obtained her PhD from the University of Vienna in 2001, specializing in the interpretation of non-state social organization. Huh? 2021. Did I say 2001? Maybe the wine reception is not the best idea before I give a talk. Apologies, everyone. 2021, specializing in the interpretation of non-state social organization in Eastern Mediterranean prehistory. So she is a Marie Curie Global Fellow at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago and the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. She's also a visiting scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and to top it all off, a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. What I find really interesting about her research is that she's combining anthropology, ethnography, cultural anthropology with archaeology. And that kind of interesting kind of melding of the two is not always done that well. So I'm really interested to hear her talk tonight about matrilineal kinship in Aegean prehistory, settlements, figures, in the absence of men. So please give me a hand in welcoming tonight's speaker. This the laser pointer's on, but you just move it back up there. Yeah, you do it for 10. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian, for this awesome introduction. I should apologize ahead that since I don't have PhD from 2001, I won't bring such a breadth of knowledge to you guys today. But please bear with me nevertheless, even though my PhD is just 4 years old. So it's really delightful to be here today. And thank you so much, Brian, for looking into my work, finding the abstract interesting, and to Cindy and everybody in the AIA Spokane Society for bringing me out here tonight. It's my pleasure to be speaking about the matrilineality in prehistoric kinship today with you, which we will dive in very soon. But before that, I would like to just mention where I come from before you start wondering where my accent comes from. So I do come from a tiny country called Slovenia, which is in Central Europe, east of Italy and south of Austria. And Slovenian national sport is kind of distinguishing ourselves from Slovakia, which is this country towards the east. And if you would like to remember Slovenia forever, I can tell you that Slovenia is the only country in the world that has love built inside its name. Yeah, so it's as Slovenia. And I hope you never mix it again. And now, since you'll learn a lot about me today, I'd like to just look out into the room and ask, who has a degree in archaeology or anthropology in the room? Can you please raise your hands? Okay, not that many. And who has been to Europe before? Oh, that's a lot. Okay. And who has been to Greece before? Okay, that's fantastic. Actually, a lot more people who travel a lot but don't have anthropology degree, which is great. So thanks a lot for coming out tonight. I will now proceed with, I will bring a little bit of Greece to you today, not necessarily Greece in a nation sense, but cultural heritage that has been found in the country. Now, let's move to the outline. First, I will just briefly speak about my background. As Brian said, I'm kind of an unusual person who started in cultural anthropology, but then moved into archaeology during my career. We will then dive deep into matrilineal kinship in Aegean, Neolithic, and Bronze Age. And then to do that, I'll bring you back to school for a little bit. And I hope that we can go through some basic definitions together before moving onwards, because I will mention those terms throughout the talk, and I just want to cover the base. And then think about the archaeological record and interpretations of matrilineal kinship in the Aegean prehistory. And finally, think through what is matrilineal through the ethnographic record. And if the time remains and if there is still some space here, I hope to present the project that I'm currently working on, that is Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship that Brian talked about, and that I am currently based in Chicago. But the project on matrilineal kinship is something that has already been published, and I'm kind of talking about the already published paper here today. All my work, nevertheless, no matter what I do, is really kind of trying to incorporate cross-cultural perspectives into Eurasian prehistory. What I call here Eurasia is really kind of Southeastern Europe and Anatolia, so the modern Turkey during the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. So now, let's start with my background. So how did I get to this topic? I hold, as Brian already slightly mentioned, I started with bachelor in cultural anthropology at the University of Ljubljana, continued in doing cultural anthropology at the University of Vienna, and then started working with archaeologists during my PhD in Vienna, where I completed my PhD in 2021. During my grad school, I was a visiting fellow and scholar at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle an der Saale in Germany, and did my first postdoc at the Austrian Archaeological Institute before moving to Chicago, where I am based now. And what brought me into archaeology or anthropology in general wasn't science, but arts. Throughout my high school, I sang in a female-only choir led by a female conductor, and we have toured many stages. We have been to Japan, which is here, one of the stages. We lived with host families in France. This is the host family from Paris, and stayed as I said, went to like Japan, did the tea ceremony and so on. And that was the first time I came to the United States at the age of 17, and we stayed with a host family in LA. And for me, that was kind of really a crucial moment in my life when I realized there is so much really cultural diversity out there that brought a completely new lens onto my life as a child from 400 people village in rural Slovenia without public transport. And ever since I knew that I want to study cultural anthropology, I want to dive deep into thinking about diversity and how many successful ways are there to be human. And for me, doing these analogies that I'll be talking about today between archaeology and cultural anthropology, or ethnography for that matter, it's kind of, if I want to draw from biology a little bit, comparing humans with dolphins. And maybe from the outset, everybody would think like, that's kind of stupid. Like they have different ways of life. Some live in water, others on land and so on. But if we would have never compared them, we would just understand their differences, but not the similarity that actually we are all mammals and we do have lungs. Both species have lungs and many other ways of the same ways of reproduction and so on. So this is really a thing that I believe one of the ways of why we need to keep on like comparing cases that are completely maybe are obscured and wouldn't make sense to compare. That's kind of the reason to think about, yes, we were humans, so what are their similarities that we can draw from each other? And now briefly about my PhD project that kind of brought me into archaeology. I was finishing up my master's in Vienna, where I was an international student. And after coming from a half-year fieldwork in India, in New Delhi, while writing up my fieldwork, I realized there was a project to be kind of written, and wasn't funded yet, but it should be some graduate student to be working with archaeologists. And even though I had no experience doing that, I thought, okay, let's try this. And yes, we were successful in obtaining funding, which is a great first step. Everybody in academia knows how important it is to get funding. And I was a part of like team with archaeologists working with pottery remains and zoo archaeologists. For example, Stephanie Amrei is right now a postdoc in Munich. And what our task was as our grad student was really kind of trying to look at the sites from cultural, anthropological, archaeological, and zooarchaeological perspectives. And in my case, I compared the early Bronze Age layers at two sites. One was Cvecek. This is, even though the name might not sound familiar to you, this is a prehistoric site next to ancient city of Ephesus in Turkey. And I looked at the early Bronze Age layers there, as well as at Platia Magula Zaku, which is placed close to modern town of Larissa in northern Greece. And that was really the time where I started working actively with archaeologists, even though I came from no background in real training in archaeology. But as a cultural anthropologist, I always understood if you want to understand others, you try to do participant observation and join them in what the others are doing. So I did a little bit of that. I joined the archaeologists in the fieldwork. So for example, this was documenting finds from Cvecek in Turkey. And I could kind of try to puzzle together the pieces of pottery on the left. And on the right side, I was really puzzled by how archaeology can work and how can it document things very meticulously. Because I was given a task to document a shell pit with basically the same type of shells, cockle shells, by length, width, height, and weight. And there were about 3,000 of them, which I'm holding in my hand there. Yeah, so that was kind of a wake-up call for me. Like, if you want to do science, it really takes a lot of time. It's not just like you dig it up and then publish, right? Yes, it takes years and a lot of time. But apart from that, that's really what I do. It's usually I would spend my time reading archaeological reports and comparing them with ethnographic data that were collected from many different countries of the world and trying to bridge these two together. And just from my PhD thesis, I will outline two publications. One is this one on No Place Like Home for Metal Workers, household-based metal production at early Bronze Age, Çukuruçi and beyond, where I try to think about metallurgy as the gendered activities, because since Gordon Child, it has been published that the first metal workers would always like the men or itinerant smiths who would produce metals in this one household per settlement, and then they move from, of course, Anatolia into Southeastern Europe and so on. But at Çukuruçi, the metal was kind of scattered all across, and arsenical metal production seemed to be kind of embedded into household activities and taking place next to other activities such as, cooking and consumption and leather working and so on. So I really kind of try to dismantle this male-centered interpretation of metalworking and putting it into, also women and children could be active participants in this metalworking, which also I dive deep into ethnographic record and show how children would be washing the ores and stuff like that. So they often played an active role. And finally, this is a slide for kind of the main output of my PhD. I try to show that whereas a lot of people argue that chiefdoms were the main social organization principle in Western Anatolia in the early Bronze Age, I tried to show that Çukuruçi seemed to be rather more hierarchical or social organization without centralized household or pooling activities, but rather decentralized social organization, which I then published in the book that was published in 2022. So now this is kind of a long introduction into the matrilineal kinship, but I nevertheless wanted to take this pause to kind of think about how I got to think about that. And if I mentioned the Platia Magula Zarku before, this is the Greek side that I worked during the PhD. There was a very famous household model found at the site dating to the 5th millennium BC. And if anybody knows anything about figurines in during Neolithic in that region, it's not surprising to find figurines. But usually they're found single finds. So you find one figurine here and one figurine there, and you never know how exactly they connect. And this find is unique because it does have kind of something like a house model in which all the figurines are intentionally placed, and it seems really fitting into this model. And at the same time, and there are also other house models for those who would be aware of that, but usually they are empty. So they don't have figurines inside. And so this house model was for a long time kind of center of many different interpretations, which I will talk later, including kind of female-centered, but also matrilineal kinship that should be evident from one of those, from these house models. Now, why I became kind of interested in matrilineal kinship was because during my PhD, there was a lot of studies coming out from archaeogenetics, which means ancient DNA research, claiming that there would be, for example, megalithic societies in Europe that were patrilineal, or others that were matrilineal, or thinking about kinship-based social inequality. And that was something for me, if you're not familiar with archaeology, a lot of archaeology talked about household archaeology and households, but kinship really wasn't the topic until very recently in archaeology, because households were kind of overtaking that term. And all of a sudden, with ancient DNA revolution, as some might call it, that term kinship really came back. And I thought, since anthropologists have written about kinship for 150 years, since the work of Louis Henry Morgan, there is something to kind of bridge these two together and look between ethnography and what archaeology can say about kinship. Now, this brings me to the second part of my talk now, to the matrilineal kinship in the Aegean prehistory, finally. So let me start with a question. What is matrilineal kinship?
Grandma, mother, yeah.
Yes, correct.
Particularly to transfer property,
Correct. Yeah,
because you guys, mama's baby, papa's baby, you always know who the mother is.
you're right. That would be also the argument by Louis Henry Morgan, why these societies were primitive in a sense, because you know who the mother is, right? But that's kind of a sexy joke, but in a sense, it's correct. It's so matrilineal kinship is about tracing the family descent and the name and the property through the female line, so that your names get inherited through women in your family, and you kind of discard men. Like you're not so, like they're not so important, even though some men can be very important, and that's usually your brother. So the brother would usually take a role of kind of father figure in these communities. And now thinking about matrilineal kinship, until the 1950s, there was like not a lot known about matrilineal kinship in ethnography or in anthropology in general. So David Schneider, here on the right, decided to assemble a summer institute or a seminar at Harvard University in 1957 to bring together a lot of scholars who would kind of encounter matrilineal societies. And then together with Kathleen Go, they published this book, Matrilineal Kinship, which is really like one of the first key publications on the topic and really systematic one on a global scale. And funnily enough, for some of them to whom like Marshall Salins says anything, that's a big anthropologist who talked about many other things but matrilineal kinship in his work. Like Marshall Salins attended that seminar with them at Harvard, but he decided not to publish with them because he just freshly finished his PhD. But his wife basically transcribed the whole book. So in a sense, there is still a little bit of Marshall Salins as a ghostwriter, or his wife being like a transcriber in that book, let's say. And as I said, before we dive deep into matrilineal kinship, let us just go through like few concepts, such as matrilineal residence, matrilineal descent, matrilocal residence, matrifocal households, and matriarchal society. And why I'd like to do that, because they are a lot of times used interchangeably especially in archaeology. And I just want to like put it out clear because I'll be referring to those terms later. So when we talk about matrilineal descent, this is really like what we talked before, unilineal descent through the female line, where you collect the inheritance and name through females in your family. So what we called before kind of matrilineal kinship. But what is also really important in those communities is like matrilocal or uxury local residence. So many of those societies with matrilineal descent follow the pattern after marriage. The couple would move in with the wife's kin. And that can be either wife's house, but also village. It doesn't have to be exactly in the same house or so, just close to her kin and not maybe like woman moving to a man's house or so, which can be common in like more in patrilocal communities. And thinking about matrifocal household, that brings kind of like the power into the question. These are really, with matrifocality in anthropology, we would call that like female-headed households, in which women decide for like what's important for someone to learn, what skills should someone acquire, and so on, and really take care of like the upbringing of children and so on. And finally, this word can like really has taken many people to write books on it, but it's kind of the question of this matriarchal society, which doesn't necessarily mean that women lead in this kind of communities, because that has been like really rare or almost not documented in cross-cultural evidence. But with matriarchy, we can refer in anthropology to cosmological and ritual orders that really centers women and women-oriented symbols. So in ritual sphere, women would have like a lot of power and things that would kind of put them on like visibility and pedestal. And let me start. There is one term that I haven't discussed, and we will get it from this pattern, from this next slide, which is, has anyone heard about Gilani? No.
See it. It's been a light. I've been looking so much, you know.
Yes. So this is a term that actually Maria Gimbutas has taken from Rihanna Eisler, from The Chalice and the Blade, and then kind of tried to describe the Neolithic in Southeastern Europe. And with Gilani, it says, it's kind of taken from the Greek woman, Gi, and then andros as man, and then in between put the letter L for kind of standing in the linking of both halves of humanity. Let's say if we think about the gender as very binary and like we connect men and women together with an L, right? But the idea was really that even though a lot of scholars today would kind of discard all the Maria Gimbutas's work because they would say she was not methodological, she did not follow the principles that every archaeologist should follow, and she would take like figurines as like mother goddesses and make everything about mother goddesses and mother religion. At the same time, Gimbutas also is kind of misquoted for just doing that. But she also really talked about balance, the so-called non-patriarchal and non-matriarchal social systems in which kind of women and men can be the same and kind of balance each other rather than women just taking over, for which she is kind of infamous for. So, and that's something that kind of made me really interested in to dive deep into who in Aegean prehistory, because Maria Gimbutas was one of them, has claimed for matrilineal kinship and how has that been done. Now, there are many ways that have been hidden in the title, but one of them is horticulture versus agriculture. And this is one of the ideas that has been taken from cultural anthropology, namely as one of key scholars, Jack Goody, published that, and I quote, "The plow is an instrument employed almost entirely by man." And this is kind of a technological invention, similar to what we have talked about before with Child promoting metallurgy as like male-only profession. This is in a sense kind of like mailing the plow and plowing and agriculture as like male-dominated as well. Even though I would know from my granny who also plowed with cows, and they would tell me like, yeah, the kids were like guiding the cow while the man was maybe plowing, and we're again like really involved in this like everyday activities as well. So, and there was this kind of, but the idea was there because like Goody made the cross-cultural study and said like in many communities, this patrilocal, so when women would then after marriage move into men's house or next to men's kin, would be kind of patrilocal and not matrilineal anymore. So that could be one of the indicators. And there are two very prominent scholars in archaeology who have taken this anthropological interpretation and translated it into archaeology. And one of them is very respected Andrew Sherrod, who argued that the communities in the 4th millennium BC really transformed from matrilineal to patrilineal society because the plow was then introduced through what he called the secondary products revolution, where you start plowing with cows, you start using those secondary products. So the cow not only for meat, but really for labor that you can gain from those animals for traction and so on. But at the same time, or in similar time, a decade later, Maria Gimbutas also argued or like supported what Andrew Sherrod has argued for, but kind of going a bit step further with like thinking about there were peaceful, sedentary, matrifocal, matrilineal, and sex egalitarian Neolithic communities in the region, versus later were kind of mixed agriculture, pastoral economy, and a class patriarchal society. But even the idea, I think it's important to kind of read these two together because one would be kind of this, the versus Gimbutas would be misread and like discarded from archaeology history. I'm sure that like probably you don't teach Brian on Gimbutas. Not too much. Yeah. Andrew Sherrod is really respected archaeologist, and I'm sure that his work continues to be taught and and promoted. But they had actually the same idea. So we have the Neolithic with matrilineality, and then we move with the Bronze Age into patrilineal systems. And the second thing that I find really exciting was the whole discussion around figurines and how we can actually read the prehistoric figurines, which don't talk back, and we have no writing about them, but there are many ways to just start understanding and reading those figurines. And just to list a few of them, they're the prehistoric figurines, which I will also circulate some of them shortly, can be seen as prehistoric religion. They can be seen as prehistoric art, as the written language, as indicators of prehistoric gender relations, as miniatures and anthropomorphs, as embodied identities and experience of anyone, and material depictions of households. And I would like to emphasize now these material depictions of households. The house model at Platia Magula Zarku has been one of those models that was heavily discussed into what can we say when we have this kind of seemingly like a house together with all these figurines, and what can we say about this context that we are looking at as archaeologists. So Platia Magula Zarku is a multi-layered tell site in close to modern town of Larissa in northern Greece. And there was, at the end of the Mesolithic period, dating to 5300 BC, was found this Neolithic house model, which context is well known and now documented and finally published, but Eva Lamstein from Austrian Archaeological Institute, who really studied the model into a lot of detail. And this was found in an open, not clear whether it's an open or closed area, but it seems like it could be an open area. But the model has been now used for many interpretations. And I will list a few of them here, which are household members could be definitely interpreted and viewed as a family. And that was argued by the initial excavator, Kostas Gallis, and also published as such. And then once the house society traveled from Mesoamerica, or from basically France with Levi-Strauss to Mesoamerica, they also made it to Europe. And a lot of scholars would have argued this is a perfect depiction of house societies in the region, where the house plays an important role in communities. Others argued for cooperative affluent societies, to which I will come very shortly what that stands for. And others have proposed this is an extended family with 2 couples and children, which was kind of, again, put forward by Eva Lamstein, which studied the model into a lot of detail. And before I circulate a 3D model of this house model to you, I'd just like to revisit this term, cooperative affluent societies. So Roberto Risch published on this house model as an evidence in where women really played a central role in politics and economy. And he said he uses this model as one of those models to support the idea of kind of women are leading in these communities, both in economy, politics, and religion. Or like religion, he doesn't mention, but it would be kind of expected if like everybody is already embodying all of this power. And he argues based on the size of figurines. And he goes, because what I circled here in red are supposedly to be female figurines, which are larger than the male ones, which is very unlikely among the living humans. We should understand that as kind of women have most of the power and exercise this power within the household. But from cultural anthropological perspectives, we also know that, for example, this is a household context. And in some societies, you can have matrifocal societies in which women do have like the dominant role within the households, but still in the politics and public decision making, that wouldn't be the case. So that role of dominant women within the household wouldn't necessarily apply to the entire community necessarily one-to-one. And that was also one of the cases that Eva Ramstein has studies after scanning it with 3D laser scanning. She was able to kind of like really into detail study every incision and look into this depiction. And she kind of argued as well that the supposedly male figurines, which if you closely look at them, there is very little direct evidence for them to be male, but nevertheless are considered as such, are kind of, they seem to be much more decorated and have something like more necklaces around it, which could be jewelry and so on. So kind of more social prestige than just the size. So it's kind of social prestige like embedded in small figurines that could be male. And then the size of these figurines maybe might be less important than like really how they are decorated and how they are put together. So I'm excited because I have brought the 3D model with me from Platia Magula Zarco house model, and I'm happy to pass it around now. So you can have a look at those figurines by yourself and think about gender and households when you look at them. There you go. So, and now let's move to the next line of evidence, in which has been also by archaeologists a lot used for interpreting matrilineal kinship in Aegean prehistory. And that's kind of the settlements. If we look at it, the Platia Magula Zarco was also one of those stealth settlements, meaning people were living at the same place for millennia. The Platia Magula Zarco has, for example, 11 meters. I'm sorry, how much is that in feet? A lot. 40 feet. So 40 feet of anthropogenic material. You can imagine like these people just like started living, like they dismantled the houses and built new houses on top of the previous ones that were not in use any longer. And that puzzled, like this is not just a classic example for Greece, but that was kind of spread, that kind of settlement, longitudinal one, from Near East into Europe. And also the tell sites draw a lot of attention, where people would say, these are, let's say Gimbuta's claim, these are religious centers and dwellings for matrilineal stem families. Others argued that these are monuments of social genealogy and memory. So people really continue living there, want to live there and persist in the environment. And for example, Stella Cvecek recently argued that Dikili-Tash, for example, as one of such tell settlements, is matrilineal for reasons that just I will mention soon. And for example, Sesklo, which is again another very like a tell site, would be patrilineal. Now let us look why people have and scholars have argued for that. So for example, Stella Cvecek looked at the architecture and the arrangements of those settlements, and she understood that like the settlements is kind of like this. It's arranged into different segments. So for example, here is a break, and here is a break, and there is a break. So that would be kind of looking into multi-lineage organization, where people would trace the descent from, she doesn't define it like whether it would be female or male, but kind of belong to the same group and organize the settlement accordingly. Another settlement like that, the tell site would be kind of what Cvecek says is matrilocal residence at Paleoscala. And why? Because at Paleoscala, there was found this large central building, which for many communities, if you know ethnography, would mean that like when people would build, let's say 800 square feet and larger houses, by the cross-cultural record, this should be kind of indicating a matrilocal household. And why? Because the idea is that once you have a house, after marriage, the women would be staying put and like live together, and men would be moving in. And that's why the house just becomes one of those, like in North American context, if you know about longhouses, right? So many of those longhouses would be matrilineal and embed those matrilocal residences. And another case would be the same, argued for the same reason, a large house that was excavated by the French team at Diquilitage and arguing for matrilineal settlement as well. But at the same time, that's kind of risky because we, in that regard, one just looks at cross-cultural patterns, which means we have found a large house, and this automatically means now a matrilocal or matrilineal residence or descent, which is really hard to prove just on one line of evidence, and someone would really need to have more argumentation to support such claims. But another interesting thing that I found in archaeology of the Neolithic Greece was this kind of binary thinking between the really tell settlements, which are then inhabited for millennia on the same place, and those Neolithic flat sites, or what some archaeologists would call flat sites. And for example, as Kotsas Kotsakis were argue for those settlements, those are kind of lineage, that lineage and descent are less stressed at these sites. People don't count so much about about their provenance or where they come from, as much as on the tell settlements. And Silas Ovesi says like those sites would kind of indicate more fluid and social organization. But when looking at ethnography, one can see that like patrilineal descent with really long lineages was found also by Raymond Ferd, or documented by Raymond Ferd, among the Tikopia in the Pacific. And they would live in small houses, like very flat sites, no continuous inhabitation for millennia, or like these meters of debris that like archaeological evidence that would pile on top of each other. They live in those flat sites, but nevertheless really care about the descent and how they trace their ancestry. So on the one hand, that's kind of like, it's kind of making it really difficult to just like look at these two sides, flat settlements versus tell settlements, and kind of make this strong distinction, because ethnographically, we know people could be tracing descent in both sides, and it is important for them where they come from. And finally, this is just a look into to Crete. There has been a lot of things discussed by Jan Driessen, who also looked at like many cases in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age Crete to kind of show that he argued together with other evidence that they could be kind of matrilineal, matrilocal communities in those places because of the large houses. But in case of Crete, also these very important figurines that were found associated with those houses. And finally, that brings me to the final point when we talk about matrilineal kinship, is really that scholars have argued, because there is absence of men, this absence of men makes matrilineal kinship really practical. And there can be many ways of why there is an absence of men, but a lot of them would say because men go into warfare or trade. But in what is really seemingly very often documented is like when people are living in this heavily trading, but also maritime communities where men do a lot of sea voyaging and it's kind of uncertain, they will return, they die at the sea. And then it's kind of practical way to transmit houses and property through the female line. Because then one knows that like, okay, we'll be stable, we're staying on land. And that doesn't mean that women don't travel in these communities, like not at all, like they still do, but maybe this kind of long sea voyaging might be rather more male dominated. And that's kind of a practical reason why property then goes through female lines. And that was also actually observed and even documented at the beginning of 20th century in Greece, in some of the islands, and also published by Jack Goody in his really seminal book, The Oriental, the Ancient, and the Primitive. And now to bring everything together, really, is kind of, let's look at this documentation by Jan Driessen of the late Minoan III period, and let's read it together. I will quote it. So he interprets it as what kind of social organization we can infer from there. So I quote, a spatially segregated but complementary gender system in which the tasks, dealings, and cult practices of men and women were seemingly relatively balanced. Men and women seem to extend to have led separate lives and activities, both socially appreciated and matching. And now, if we move forward or backward to 1989, I would like to pose a question. Does this not resemble Gimbutas's proposal of balanced, non-patriarchal or non-matriarchal social system in kind of where women and men are balancing each other and so on? So this was something that I kind of started understanding by diving deep into the interpretation of matrilineality in prehistory, how Gimbutas, as a female scholar, was through time really excommunicated and put to like fringes of scholarship, while it has been it was continuously being able that scholars claim very similar things but would never refer to the same work to her work, because they would use either new terms or like repackage it into a new idea, although the idea was really old, or let's say in that case 2 decades old or so. Yes, and that was kind of a thing that I published in a paper, which I will show later. But this is kind of the take-home message, that matrilineal kinship was there at the fringes of archaeology. It's not maybe now coming back through ancient DNA, but there have been things that were published on the topic before. And some scholars have thought about the possibility to be matrilineal or matrilocal. But a lot of those scholars were kind of, or one of them was Maria Gimbutas, who was kind of excommunicated. But now with the ancient DNA as a fancy new method, the same idea can come and be proven through scientific methods again. And now let me turn from archaeology to ethnographic thinking about matrilineal kinship. And for that, let me pose a question to you. So from now, we are moving away from the Aegean, Neolithic, and Bronze Age to kind of thinking ethnographically about matrilineality. And for that, I'll start with a question. If I have a bag and I put money into it, to whom does the money belong? To me or to the bag? So, so who thinks the money belongs to me? Yeah? Who thinks the money belongs to the bag? A few of you. Okay. So, and yeah, so both things are perfectly fine. It can be both. And this is not my analogy, but it was really Audrey Richards who posed this question about thinking about matrilineal society, which is called Bemba in Africa. And she goes, and I quote, if I have a bag and put money into it, the money belongs to me and not to the bag, as anybody mostly in the West would think, right? But the Bemba say a man puts semen into a woman, and yet the child belongs to her and not to him. And even this is like a very biological description of, let's say, sexual procreation and like birth giving and reproduction. It's kind of still an important matter of what matrilineal kinship actually does. It does disturb a biological concept of a father and his claim to the child. It's not father's claim to the child. It's really the woman who is at the center of that community, and she owns the child. And that will be the child which translates, if she is a woman, the descent to the next generation. So this was kind of like a quote to really like open mind that even though we usually trace our descent from both mothers and fathers, in other communities, this might not be the case. Even though, of course, just like us, you need usually 2, but now with IVF, there are other ways to like reproduce, to make a child, right? So it's kind of thinking about how societies, even though we do things in very similar ways, how do we explain them, and to whom children belong and to whom property belongs, can vary massively across different societies. And in ethnographic record, there are only 13% of the 1,265 societies that one can find in Murdoch's ethnographic atlas are matrilineal. So really just a margin. But what is interesting is that many of them center, look at this, where we are, very close to us in the Pacific Northwest, in American Southwest. And then what we see here is like kind of African matrilineal belt, as some scholars would call it, and in the Pacific. And if you remember, we cannot explain them through all of the things, but as I said, like seafaring could be one of those activities, right? Or sometimes people would say cattle herding and stuff like that, which would also not explain the American Southwest. But there are many cases that the people or scholars try to explain it, why there is a matrilineal community. But even though I'm not gonna give you an explanation today, what I would like to do together with you is just look at two matrilineal communities that are from two different parts of the world, don't share common ancestry or so, and follow the matrilineal descent. And just, even though they share descent, they are organized very differently. So I'll take the case from American Southwest among the Hopi, and a case from Trobriand Islands, which is in Melanesia in the Pacific, to show how different matrilineal communities can be. So whereas the Hopi would kind of follow the matrilocal residence, and I said after marriage, the couple moves close to the female side of the family, the Trobrianders would follow Everlunkos residence, which would mean they would marry or like move in with the mother's brother. And that's kind of the location of where to move after marriage. And versus among the Hopi, which were, I'm talking about Hopi here documented in the beginning of 20th century, and the same goes for Trobriand Islands. Women would be the ones who owned the houses and storage and the property. It was in the Trobriand Islands, it was really men which were owning the houses and storage and like the big yam houses that they owned. Among the Hopi, it was women who made decisions within the houses. So it was kind of a matrifocal, women-led household. But among the Trobrianders, it was men who were kind of deciding what the children should learn and so on. But this man was not the father of the child, but the mother's brother. So as I said, in those communities, it's kind of still, because it's still the matriline that really matters, and you trust only the kin through the maternal line and not the other kin. And among the Hopi, the highest political office was kind of the Council of Elders, in which, because they had kind of age grades, everybody reaches one day the stage where it's respected with age and with a lot of recognition for their knowledge. So even though I made a joke that maybe my PhD is now from 2001, but if I was maybe in a different community where elders are really respected, then that would have been quite a difference, right? And this Council of Elders was created by both men and women. So it wasn't just single gender. But on the other hand, the highest political office among the Trobrianders was the chief. And this chief, guess what, was a male. So even though you trace the property through female line and so on, the highest political office would be still in female lineage and connected to the females, but nevertheless, it's occupied by a man. And versus the decisions in public domains, such as whom do we go trade with and whom do we go into war with or we fight with and so on, were made by this Council of Elders, which was really highly trusted among the Hopi. It was the chief which really made these centralized kind of decisions about Trobrianders. And this is kind of, based on this comparison, we can also say that like versus one community, which are the Hopi, can be living in decentralized social political organization, the Trobrianders really live in this very centralized political organization, even though both communities were matrilineal. And I think that this is kind of the picture that one can show this diversity within something that we would call one type of community, but it's really just many versions of what we would call one type. And so to summarize what I have been just talking about is kind of that societies with matrilineal descent do not necessarily share the same residence pattern as we've seen from the Hopi and Trobriand Islands. Women do not necessarily own houses, storage, or land in these communities, as in some communities it can be mother's brother or the men who are in charge of some of those things. Women are not necessarily heads of households, as we have seen from the Trobriand Islands. It can be the woman's brother who is kind of like steering the house. And women do not necessarily hold the highest political role. And finally, they can be both centralized or decentralized. So on the one hand, we call about it as matrilineal kinship, but it's really a mosaic of communities that are living in very different ways that we would kind of trace as matrilineal just because they trace their descent through the maternal line. So what can we say about matrilineal kinship in Aegean prehistory based on what we have just learned? So it's one thing is that matrilineal descent could be one of the possibilities among sedentary groups in the Aegean Neolithic, but really just one of the possibilities. It could be, there could be also patrilocal and bilateral, such as like us, where we trace descent from both sides, mothers and fathers. And there could be communities in the past that we definitely could expect that were rather gender egalitarian and such, similar to maybe the ones in Hopi, where men and women and all genders were kind of seen as more complementary to each other rather than one gender overtaking the other. That matrilineal kinship could coexist with patrilineal and bilateral descent. For example, I didn't mention it for the Trobriand case, but like when the Trobriand matrilineal community was documented, they were just in the islands next door. There were patrilineal communities living in the same region. So it doesn't have to be that we move from one stage, as some would think in evolutionary ways, from matrilineality to patrilineality, but that can be really a coexistence of different kinship systems in the region at the same time. So, and finally, if there is still, of course, a strong need for feminist approaches in archaeology, since we need to be thinking critically about gender and kinship at all times. And as I argued that in my publication, which I will show quickly, was not citing Gimbutas led to kind of the new concepts that even though they were quite old ideas. And that has been an article that has been published. So most of my talk that I discussed today is a very, when you're talking about having a book club, you can like revisit that because it's, this article is published in the latest issue of Archaeological Dialogues. And it's my article commented upon by 3 other scholars, and then my reply to them. And in this article, I really argue strongly for why archaeology and cultural anthropology should be working together and comparing things across each other, and why we need to have more such synergies in the future as well. Now, I see that I'm getting very close to the end of my talk, but I nevertheless want to say just few words about, because on the one hand, this is a concluded project. It has been something that I've worked on right after completing my PhD in 2021 during COVID. And I was a visiting scholar at the Austrian Archaeological Institute in Athens, in Greece, where I spent time in the library mostly, but also visiting other institutes and working with like local specialists to discuss the topic. And I'm really glad that it's now out there and published finally. But the project that I'm working now on at the Field Museum, and I promise you, I'll try to stick to 5 minutes and really not be too long about it, is the Aegean project. And if you remember this thing before, during my PhD, when I was finishing, people would argue for like patrilineality, matrilineality, and so on. And a lot of times in these archaeogenetic papers, which are published in usually very high-ranking journals, such as Science and Nature and so on, The way one argues for patrilineality or matrilineality is just by linking people on genetic pedigree, which would be a kinship tree, and see whether they relate through male or female. And after that, you have the answer. And I think that like this talk was like a good lead to kind of understanding that it's not that easy. And kinship has been really a long-standing, important topic in the discipline of cultural anthropology. And if I quote here Robin Fox, which has changed since the 1976, but he said, kinship is to anthropology what logic is to philosophy or the nude is to art. It is the basic discipline of the subject. And even though it is not any longer, maybe, and today cultural anthropologists really focus on things like ethnicity, identity, race, and gender, much more than kinship. Nevertheless, there is a lot of literature that archaeologists or archaeogeneticists can really draw on and learn from cultural anthropology. And as one of them was really also David Schneider, whom I mentioned earlier, that organized the seminar on matrilineal kinship. He was also one of those that said, like, we should abandon kinship studies in anthropology in this book, because he said it always prioritizes biology and we always look at all communities through biological eyes. But nevertheless, that did not stop anthropologists to think about kinship, and they continue to publish. And thankfully, also indigenous scholars contribute to the debates today, and make the debate on kinship pretty much alive. And in the project that I'm looking at now is basically thinking about two basic questions of, first one, how can the material structures such as settlements, building, artifacts, and biological markers be read as material codes of prehistoric kinship, which my talk was basically a lot about. And second, how can ethnographic reports exemplify rather than verify variability in kinship during prehistory? So if I would think about natural sciences, which try to verify a lot of things, what with my qualitative anthropological approach, what I would like to do is kind of exemplify diversity of like interpretations that one can put forward once you place these people on a genetic pedigree, let's say. And the sites where I do that are located in Southeastern Europe and in Anatolia. One of them is also, and for that I use the mixed methods approach, in which I kind of try to combine the kinship related approaches in archaeology, which means publish ancient DNA data, stable isotopes, settlement patterns, and dialogues around households, with a qualitative controlled comparison with the ethnographic cases, and finally a regional comparison between sites to see whether they were organized in the same ways or different ways. And as one of those sites is also Çatalhöyük, which is an important Neolithic site in Turkey, I'm excited that I was able to spend 2 weeks in Ankara at the Ancient DNA lab led by Mehmet Somel, discussing one of the final publications that just appeared earlier this year in Science. And I was able to kind of, as if I said before, I spent time with archaeologists learning how they document their material and how they come to their interpretations. In this project, part of the project is also trying to spend some time with geneticists in their labs and trying to understand how one comes to the conclusion that one comes to really kind of trying to combine archaeology, archaeogenetics, and cultural anthropology. And one of my recent papers that that came from this project was titled "Why?" Oh, that's kind of bad. Why kinship still needs anthropologists in the 21st century, where I kind of push forward the idea kinship is not only biological, which is very often kind of put forward in those ancient DNA papers, but we really need to put forward social approaches such as adoption, fostering, and so on, also in prehistory, not just today, because we know that people were not raised in nuclear households, but really in extended families, and adoption must have played an important role in times where a formula wasn't available. Now, finally, just to show this one quick example, why I think it's important and interesting to look into this topic. And this was not something I could plan because this wasn't published yet, but it's really how many how cycles of theory repeat each other. And this is an example of Çatalhöyük, where in 1967, the original excavator, James Mallard, would propose that the site was matrilocal and matrilineal. And then after Ian Hodder excavated the site already for a decade, he proposed that instead of matrilineality, we see the history houses in which people bury most of their dead and are most elaborately decorated are the ones that kind of bind the community together. And later, a decade later, we have Ian Kite, who says, oh, it's actually house society, which seems to be the case because house is at the center of the living at Çatalhöyük and so on. And this was 2024, published in bioRxiv, and now in Science in 2025. It was Yunjo et al., which kind of proposed, based on archaeogenetic data, these are female lineages. So I hope you can see like where have we moved from 1967 to 2024 through new ancient DNA data. And so to really finish here, what I'm trying to do in my project is kind of bringing people together. And if you see a lot of faces here, these are people who usually wouldn't go to the same conferences because they are cultural anthropologists, archaeologists, and geneticists who might try to bring together in Toronto and in Chicago earlier last year. And there will be appearing a publication on special section on kinship trouble, traversing interdisciplinary boundaries between archaeology, archaeogenetics, and social cultural anthropology, which I'm publishing together with Mansa Ragavan from the University of Chicago and Penny Bickle from the University of York. And I will also lead a 5-day seminar next year in May 2026 with some exciting scholars, again, from genetics, archaeology, and cultural anthropology on descent and where do we move forward after the DNA revolution in archaeology. And finally, this is a conference that we organized in Vienna in October last year, so about a year ago. And this is the message that I would like to finish with, was we asked the participants who were from all different fields that I just mentioned, so what are you taking away from this workshop? And here is something I would like to share from a lot of different things, also nice people, which is fantastic because a lot of times people would argue in journal articles, but then until you meet and you're actually able to discuss, it's really that the spark happens and you realize, the other is just human and they try to do the best of their science that they can. And together we can do maybe better science. So with these words, I'm really thanking you for having me here, but at the same time, thanking my amazing mentor, Bill Parkinson, who has nominated me to be part of this national lecture. So I wouldn't be here without him. And Bill knows about this slide, so I'm not sure whether he knew it's gonna be recorded, which is maybe not cool. So this is what he has in his office. And Bill is not only a #1 daddy, but also a #1 mentor. And he's been great to work with and really been supportive for all my ideas and research that I want to pursue. So thanks to him and thanks to you guys for having me today over. Thanks for your attention. I say goodbye with a slide of Chicago. So if you're in Chicago anytime, please do reach out. And thanks for listening and bearing with me. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you. Yes, please.
Information from medieval Italy throws some light on the differentiation between the Hopi and the because economics, survival, how you make your money, how you live is an important part of it. If you've got, for example, if you look at Genoa from the 11th through 13th century, when it was local, largely almost subsistent agriculture, small line manufacturing within the home and that kind of thing. You had bilateral inheritance. Once they moved out and began commerce, maritime commerce, the farther you have to travel, the more that means that you have to have a head of the family, male, deciding who does what. Venice is interesting really similar but also different, because Venetian women owned their dowries, which is very unusual in Italy. And part of the reason was, as you were saying earlier, you know, the men are away for such a long time, but also Venice looked to the east. Venice was very influenced by Greece and the Aegean and Byzantium. It was under the Byzantine Church, whereas Genoa looked west, obviously. And then things change over time, but I think when you look at, for example, Hopi, you've got relatively small scale agriculture, but enough to survive on. That's where you tend to get multiple smaller households and women have a larger role. With the Trobrianders, it looked like they were doing a lot of traveling and all the rest of it, and that tends to put more pressure on it becoming patriarchal.
Yes. I mean, I would agree. And like this kind of horticulture, agriculture, I think it's because Cudi really argued for it based on cross-cultural comparison and statistical support. So if one wants to look at it from statistical point of view, yes, it's really would explain that once you have small scale horticulture without large animals, usually, so no large cattle or camels in other parts of the world as well, you would kind of have rather female-centered communities. But at the same time, then it's also communities such as like in Melanesia or so, in the highlands, for example, they also had small-scale horticulture, but they would be patrilineal. So no matter, like we can find like this very big cross-cultural comparison, which is statistically significant, but at the same time, there will be always an example that might go against the rule. So, which is also really exciting to look at both. On the one hand, you have an explanation, but at the same time, you know, it could be different. And there is an evidence that it was different. So, and that's a good question. Yeah. So for example, like in the Melanesian case, so if I speak about the Barua, for example, they didn't have large cattle, but were organized in among the male communities, was that sold and like, so they were living in highlands of Papua New Guinea, and there it's really hard to get salt. So it's far away from the sea. There is like really big mountain ridges, and how they produce salt was actually from like local plants that salinated, and then they extracted, like they needed to have special technology from making a special oven to extract salt from these plants. And that was kind of seemingly a male profession, and they extracted a lot of value from this extraction. And a lot of people would come to them to trade for salt. And that kind of created also this, you know, new status to this kind of men who were the salt makers or the great hunters and this kind of things that kind of pushed to elevate their status, even though cross-culturally they should be matrilineal, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In the Pacific Island matrilineal example you used, what would happen to the young women who didn't have uncles?
To the younger women who didn't have uncles?
Yeah.
Oh. That's a very good question. I mean, I think that's a really good thing. I didn't think about it, I must say that. I would say that maybe in many cases would be like guaranteed to have an uncle because they might have larger families than what we have in smaller nuclear households. But this is really something that I would need to look up, and I wouldn't necessarily know. Yeah, it could be that like it could be maternal father. So I would still think that my gut feeling would be it should be some maternal kin. So if it's not a brother, then it should be probably the father who would be the heading and steering the household. Yeah. So someone like still the male, but from the female side of the family. Thank you. Yeah, please, Brian.
I remember reading Malinowski back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a cousin.
I was just
It
saying,
was a cousin as well. Oh, okay.
Uncle, I think.
in Venice,
Is it?
it's a mother's cousin, yeah.
A mother's cousin.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So there would be some male that wasn't the,
Mhm.
you know, spouse. basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but also cousins from
I
the.
haven't read that in
Mhm.
years.
Okay. Mhm. Thanks.
So this is a big question, but I kept thinking about it. Where did religion or worship enter into this whole analysis? Because you hear about that,
Mhm.
where it was religion at one point was matrilineal,
Mhm.
and then it changed to Catholic.
Mhm.
So how does religion come to bear on this and when?
That's a beautiful question. I think that Brian can like jump in as well if I'm wrong on that one. But I would say, as an outsider looking into archaeology, I would say archaeologists, especially in prehistory, don't like to talk about religion, right?
This is why I do historic archaeology.
Right. So talking about religion in prehistory is also very challenging because you cannot have a lot of data to support your arguments with. The data are very scarce. So it's like always, but it's the same with kinship. Like it's always an inference. And if there was, let's say, a silent agreement in prehistoric archaeology, we don't talk about religion. It was then, let's say, Maria Gibutas, who started reading a lot about Nordic mythologies, and she was from Lithuania. So she started diving deep into Lithuanian culture, and I don't know, by some explanations, Lithuanians are the closest to Proto-Indo-Europeans and maintain a lot of like pagan rituals of like around summer solstice and winter solstice and all of that. So Maria Gibutas really went that way. And I think that she was the one, although I cannot prove, but I think so. She called herself that way. She called a subfield called archaeomythology. Yes, that was her explanation of what she was doing, trying to combine mythology in a way and archaeology to think about religion in the past, in a sense. And a lot of scholars would just not take that as a discipline or a field or a legitimate kind of explanation for anything. So it was really kind of, I believe that because she talked about religion, like a lot of other things then got kind of, like that's why she also became kind of excommunicated, because she would, if you would ask probably, like where the house model that I showed, like if you would ask her, yeah, like she would say these are mother goddesses, and we have now the mother goddess there, and then this is a sun, which is the sun king, and the moon queen and whatever. So things that also can really be hardly accepted for prehistoric records. Yeah.
That's something to be developed at some point.
Oh yes.
But not by anybody here.
No.
Questions as well.
Okay. Oh, I see. Tiff said, like in the house model in the lower right quadrant, is that a Cycladic figurine? So actually, that's a very good question. But Cycladic figurines, if you mean like those third millennium Cycladic figurines, they are much later than Platia Magura Zarku, which is like from 5300. So not necessarily, no. Oh, the illustration clarifies it is not. Thank you. So Tiff also mentioned from the chat whether when looking at isotopic analysis, if I was focusing on strontium to see migratory patterns in relation to kinship and adoption, and looking at the gender trophic analysis. And this is exactly what I'm interested in my current project, to kind of not just take, because in what you've seen mostly in my talk, I try to see how archaeologists, based on material culture and evidence of houses and figurines, have argued for matrilineal kinship without ancient DNA and without fancy analysis such as isotopes and so on, or not, let's say, scientific science archaeology. And this is my current project, is embedding all of them, like bringing all together, like the house context, but also really the isotope data and ancient DNA. Yes.
No other questions? Can we please show our appreciation for those that One second, sorry.
Okay.
So we always do each talk, we do both a book, yeah, the tickets to win the book, sorry, my boards are filled. I really should not do wine at these wine receptions, sorry. And also,
we do a student membership. We give away a membership to the AIA.
I believe there's only one student ticket tonight.
That's great.